Let me silence this.
All right. Welcome everybody to this episode of the Navigating Now Roundtable series. I am Anthony Ewing, a partner here at Thougtium. We bring great discussions with great leaders to you every Thursday afternoon. That is a part of our Navigating Now Roundtable series. And today we have an incredible guest, which I'll introduce here in just a moment. We want to thank everybody who is joining us via LinkedIn. We also stream live to YouTube and Facebook. We also want to invite all of the folks who registered and will be attending via Zoom. So thank you all for joining. Make sure that you've got the chat box open if you are a part of the Zoom webinar. You can ask questions throughout for our guests. We'll make sure that we find an opportunity or two to pause and take those questions. And we'll wrap things up at about 10 till. We've got a lot of great things to talk about today. I'm really excited to introduce our guest today. You know, week after week, we bring talented leaders to the table to unpack topics that matter most to leaders and teams. And today, I know the title says The Future of Work. I know that's a very broad title. But we've got an expert in the realm of designing for the future skills and capabilities that we will need in both education and the workforce. And Rich Busby is a director at Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy, or also known as IMSA. He's played a lot of different roles. He's got an incredible background, including some deep practitionership in learning and development. And we are really excited to unpack the topic today of broadskilling and the future of work. So Rich, welcome to the roundtable. Thanks so much for joining.
Well, thank you. It's a great opportunity for me. My pleasure.
Wonderful. So let's get into it. You know, we love to learn about our guests because in talking with you and kind of prepping with you, you've got a really interesting background that almost dates back to your childhood in terms of developing this passion for learning and development. So maybe take us back, tell us a little bit about Rich, who you are, and you know what brought you to where you're at today in focusing on the future of work.
Absolutely. So one of the things I think is important to know about how I got to where I am now in terms of broadskilling is my background. I'm first generation in college. I grew up in the rural South, and my father never finished high school, but he had a commitment. He raised me with an expectation that you're going to go to college, you're going to succeed, you're going to study computers. So the reason that's significant is because I realize now, looking back, that I was missing some big picture knowledge that would have helped me accelerate my career and made me much more employable. And that's, the deep rooted part of what my broadskilling is important. So broadskilling as a name, it's hard to think about something without a name. So I gave a name to broadskilling. That actually came out of a discussion with a CIO. So let me just start out. Broadskilling is really a framework to enable students to enter the workforce. Before you start skilling, before you even get into reskilling and upskilling, you got to meet the entry criteria to be employable. That's what broadskilling is. And there's three components to that. And the first component is having your own informed point of view about what the future of work is. And that's significant because if you walk into, before you walk into the doors of a college or any kind of post-secondary education, you need to understand what's relevant. The second component is having a plan that's specifically geared toward being relevant to what you learned about the future. And then the third component is, how do I provide evidence of my skills that I am going to be employable? What's attractive to an employer? And that ranges from credentials, what credentials I need, to how I present myself. 2 weeks ago, we had a presentation about building your personal brand. Absolutely relevant. It inserts right into that realm. I'm very passionate about this part of it. I could talk and talk and talk. So interrupt me at any time.
No, absolutely. And I want to unpack broadskilling because I'm in learning a little bit more from you. Although you work in the education realm, I just feel like even just the overall approach and methodology of broad skilling can be applicable in so many different industries. Of course, we focus on the adult learning experience. We focus on designing and delivering progressive programs for professionals. And I just feel like some of this foundational identification of those skills and the capabilities that you truly need in order to, whether it's to get a great education or to fulfill a great education, step into your next role, that foundational almost pre-work, or that foundational understanding of your skills and how they map to your end goal is so important. So I want to dive into that, but let's talk a little bit about this concept of the future of work. When did you become interested in the future of work, and how did that become a part of your everyday vernacular?
Yeah, so two reasons. One is I had a conversation with an IT professional who's in a financial services industry, and he said, look, Rich, I understand where you are. You're working in a school, but you're not relevant. So what do you mean I'm not relevant? He said, look, in my industry, unless you have at least some sort of cloud practitioner certification, we won't even talk to you, even in a functional role. And that sort of piqued my interest right there. So, personally, what I started doing is taking courses. I took AWS fundamentals courses, started looking into Salesforce just to kind of get up to speed on cloud architecture. So that's one aspect. The other part is I participate in the Executive Learning Exchange, which is a great sort of HR crowdsourcing organization. Fabulous. A lot of discussion there around what's missing. When we go looking for recruits, why is it so hard to get the people with the capabilities we need? And I did some presentations with some wonderful people, learned a lot from being with them. And what I walked away with is I took notes furiously, and I ended up with about 15 skill gaps. And that sort of churned and churned and churned. And I'm pretty intuitive, so I started talking to other people about it, and it sort of occurred to me that there's really three groups. I can classify these into three areas. One is understanding what the future of work requires. The second is I need an absolute skilling plan to be relevant to that future. And you know what? A resume is not enough. So building your personal brand, showing artifacts of work, building a portfolio, that's what makes the difference. And how do you make that accessible to future employers? The other part of it that was really eye-opening to me is this, the term gig economy just shows up frequently. But the skill basis for that is entrepreneurial skills. And where is that taught? Is there an expectation in K through 12 that kids should prepare for that?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because I'd love to even peel back, what does entrepreneurship mean in, let's call it higher education or even early education, as we're starting to bring this, term to younger and younger demographics. 10 years ago, entrepreneurship meant that you went out and you took a huge risk and you bet a ton of money or your entire career on an idea or a product. And in most cases, you were kind of a loser if you're an entrepreneur, right? Because most entrepreneurs were known to have certain failures. Fast forward now today, entrepreneur is much more a mainstream term. And everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. And so I almost think that term has become even more convoluted and requires even more definition, because yes, there's a lot more opportunity through the gig economy, through the proliferation of technology, allowing us to spin up new ideas and work more independently. But it's almost as if we have a responsibility to almost define entrepreneurship so that younger and younger students understand what it is.
Yeah, and maybe talk about the outcomes. When I think about what broadskilling is, I think about, what's the epitome? Do I know somebody who epitomizes that? And actually I do. I know a kid who just graduated from high school. He's now a freshman, lives in Huntington Beach, California. Epitomizes broadskilling. He has been generating income since high school by monetizing and helping other businesses in Huntington Beach leverage social media, like TikTok, YouTube,
Yep.
To sell ads. And he and his friends have started creating videos. And I'm just struck by, without even the word entrepreneurship or formal education, some of these kids get it. They're like, hey, I can make money. This empowers me.
Yep.
And so maybe one way to do it is to tell those success stories.
Yeah,
so,
no, and there's plenty of them. And, I think, again, the younger demographic is really understanding that there is all kinds of opportunity. And you no longer have to follow the, traditional career path. And it's interesting, again, but without dating myself, I try to date myself on every episode here. But I was part of maybe one of the last generations that came up with a fairly traditional educational and career pathing. And by education, that meant, you went through elementary and high school. You chose to go away for an undergraduate degree if you had the resources to do it. And you found an opportunity with an organization that offered you the stability and the challenge that you needed to potentially spend 10, 20, 30 years within that organization. And it's so interesting because that was just, 15 years ago that I was, entering the workplace, and my options were a lot more limited. And I had this mentality that I really needed to find an organization that I could, dig my heels into, an organization that could almost exclusively support my growth and my development. And that was it's a tall order, right? For you to have to find your forever place when you graduate college. And here we are 15 years later, and students have much more autonomy. They have much more opportunity. And I think with that comes, as educators, a responsibility to provide them structure, to provide them guidance and mentorship. And it sounds like this concept of broadskilling is almost like the tool bag that you would give a student as they start to address their career and potentially look at some of these alternative career pathways.
It is, because from a learning perspective, it's all based on inquiry and helping kids understand what questions to ask. And that stays with them throughout their life. I mean, I think about this stuff, and that's sort of how I codified broadskilling. It's like, what do I think I need to do to stay relevant? And then I'm like, we don't teach kids this. I should probably develop a tool set. I work with kids for 12 years. And then, but prior to that, I did corporate L&D, and we did a lot of inquiry-based learning there, problem-centered learning, and it all seemed to fit. And it is a tool set. So what I did was I create a research plan so kids can develop their own plan. And long term, wouldn't it be cool if we had this plan that we kept alive all the time, this broadskilling plan, or maybe once a year you revisit that and you ask those 3 questions. What's the future hold? What do I need to be relevant? What am I doing? But you prompted me to think of something. We talked about the future, and this metaphor came to me, and I think it's kind of helpful. So, I often think of the future as, way out there. And then, here we are now, and there's a gap between me and the future. But lately I've been thinking that it's more like surfing. Like if we're surfing on the crest of a wave, and then you can see out about how the waves are going to interact with you up ahead. But the future is really now. We're on the cutting edge of the future right now. And the issue I have, and the impetus for broadskilling, is some of the people aren't up on the board yet. They're kind of behind us. Yep. And the future economy, needs people who know how to get out there and paddle and get up and succeed and adapt to what's changing in the future as it unfolds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're what I hear you say is that at the center of broadskilling are opportunities for students to self-identify where they're headed and what they need. And we're using this methodology a lot in adult learning, particularly in some of our more advanced learning and development programs, where traditionally adult learning education or corporate education, training, sales training, whatever it may be, was often seen as a shelf of resources. And the topics of those resources were built off a standard set of capabilities that either your team or your organization was really looking to drive in their employees. I would argue that the democratization of curriculum and digital content, and the fact that we can YouTube anything and I could go and learn about anything for free today, has changed us as we consume education in our personal lives, and is very quickly now changing the expectations and the behaviors that we have in our education and, in my experience, in our careers. So, for example, there are a lot of professionals out there that are doing one thing in an organization. And just because their organization does not support another accreditation or another focus, maybe they're in sales and they really want to get into marketing, they now have the access to go and train as a marketer, and you don't need to go get an MBA to do it. And right. You can spin up a side hustle as a marketer, actually doing the work. And I think this is drastically changing the requirements that our adult learners have. We have to be open to alternative credentialing. We have to be open to allowing people to explore their career outside of their given role. And I wonder if if you're finding some commonality in what our younger generation or our students now are requiring.
Yeah, you mentioned autonomy, and I think agency and autonomy. Some of the kids I work with at IMSR particularly are very empowered and are very curious, and they do exactly that. They take advantage of every learning asset. And what's different is the paradigm of delivering instruction, which is kind of the old model we grew up with in education, to enabling learning. And that's the pivot. And it's about, the role of the instructor is to design a learning experience and resources such that it enables learning. And you have to know your audience really well. So that's a pivot. And I think what's slow to change is in education, it's hard for seasoned educators to have the time and resources and incentives, which is a big problem in education, or a challenge, to make that pivot. To have administrators be okay with that, to say, we're going to enable this kid, and maybe we have the student develop their own learning plan, and that's really hard for administrators to change to.
Yeah,
but you're right. That is the reality. That is this generation. And they don't want to follow that path, that paradigm we grew up with, and incur lots of debt. And and it's interesting too, what's happened with the pandemic response. It's kind of accelerated this idea of, I'm going to choose my own path.
Yep.
And I'm not going to go to the university and pay 50, 80,000. I can stay here and take the online equivalent.
Yes. Totally. I totally get it. And it's interesting how the pandemic has accelerated a lot of change that was already coming at us in terms of higher education. I mean, well before the pandemic, we were talking about, and we've been talking about, particularly over the last 5 years, the cost of college tuition and students electing to go in different directions, putting pressure on universities to take a look at the curriculum that they're offering and the price at which they're offering it. And I don't know if we've necessarily seen the brunt of it, but it's going to be really interesting to see what happens as we move through this pandemic, and colleges, universities are no longer able to even physically host their students. So do you have thoughts on maybe the future of the college campus, if you will, as we move through the pandemic?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's going to be different. I mean, if you want to track what's happening in the college, there's a great website, Education Dive, and you can see that colleges are closing. There's a lot of economic pressure. But I had a friend of mine in India who had this idea of water logic. So when you encounter an obstacle, you just flow around it, and that's sort of the thing colleges have to embrace, which is, what's my current situation? How are we going to adapt to enable learning? What if we, instead of modifying our curriculum tracks, let our students pick their own curriculum tracks? What if we, instead of a 4-year degree, offer, there's a lot of talk today around credegrees, which is a very streamlined, skill-focused credential. I think that's what's going to happen. I think the market's going to drive that. Um, I don't know how that's going to happen. I think it's going to happen locally with very adaptive sense and respond universities. And it's going to be in limited programs first. But I think that's what's going to happen. I mean, we have kids today doing their own planning, choosing online programs. They have this expectation that there's this whole marketplace like an app store and I can download and sequence my own courseware.
Yep.
Not how it's been working.
Yeah. So how would something like Broadskilling support, let's call it the modern learner that is looking outside of the traditional education pathway, right? These younger students that maybe already know in their mind that like a 4-year degree is just, not going to be for them. So maybe take us through like how Broadskilling would support some of these alternative pathways that we're starting to see more and more.
Absolutely. So Broadskilling, the framework it prompts a series of questions, and the user will go through there and create their own plan. But that's just the structure. But what's cool about it is, and helpful, is that you explore the different career clusters. And the insight is that, a lot of companies today, or some of the leading companies, are not requiring degrees. They're just looking for skill sets. So what's relevant about it is you can learn what those in-demand skill sets are and find your own pathway to get those. And as long as you can demonstrate those skills, you're employable. I think that's the difference. You can create your own learning pathway. And that's one of the phrases I use. One of the outcomes is you pick and choose your learning pathway based on what you find is relevant. And that's the whole idea of developing your own informed point of view. Because I can tell you and I can tell a person what I think they need to be doing to prepare for the future. But it's much more powerful if a student does that research and it becomes part of their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the differences. They have agency, they have an informed point of view.
Yep.
They can then have a relevant discussion with an employer. And that's the part that became clear to me. My understanding, I'll give you an example. My understanding of sort of technology architecture and structure was from the 90s through the early 2000s when I did training in that area. I've been really busy doing operations and other things since I came to IMSIS, so I've become a little bit less informed and less relevant in that area. So I've had to sort of skill myself back up to have those relevant discussions. The kids I work with today have great ideas, very entrepreneurial ideas, but they're still missing some things about, how do I have a plan? How do I have a brand presence? What do you mean by an informed point of view? Because what they see is the one thing they're interested in and not the breadth of opportunity. So Broadskilling exposes kids to 16 career clusters, emergent technologies. They do their own research, modalities of work, the gig economy versus traditional economy versus working remotely. Then it asks questions around, do you know yourself and your aptitudes? What are your likes and dislikes? Where's the opportunity, which is a central question. And that's the key outcome. We can figure out the brand part, your personal brand, but the core of it is having a plan to be relevant and remain relevant. So even outside of a student realm, I actually do ask myself those 3 questions a lot. Am I relevant? Yeah. And I think that's the difference. The idea would be, what I'd really love is a lifelong learning sort of platform where you have your own account and kind of expand Broadskilling so that you always have this ongoing revisiting of your own personal strategy.
Yep.
I think that's the key. And I think people do it today. One of the points of view I have about the future is it's a lot of the same stuff we do now, but some things are much more frequent and much more in demand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And at the end of the day, it's providing tools and frameworks for, you used the term earlier that I really appreciate, agency. The ability to self-identify, the ability to then organize resources around, the opportunity that you have, whether that is, to choose a certain educational or career path, or potentially to identify an opportunity that you have within an existing organization. And again, I just love the connection between, what you're doing in education and what we do to design for adult learners. It's so familiar. It's so familiar. Enabling people to have choice, enabling people to identify the opportunities, reverse engineer, and most importantly, enabling people to try. And I think what's so remarkable about entrepreneurship today is that it allows younger and younger folks, students, to try different things and to do it with very little investment and to do it with a endless amount of resources at their fingertips. And most of it is on the back of, what is now the internet, or more specifically social media, which again are these just incredible pathways and conduits for people to pilot, to try, to put their potential ideas and products out there and to get feedback.
Yeah.
All of these platforms, which we didn't have 20 years ago. Maybe we did. They were just a lot less expansive, if you will.
And they weren't available to anybody with a simple device. I mean, when I took the AWS training, I was able to spin up an EC2 instance, my own sort of server instance in the cloud from a Chromebook. How powerful is that, and how accessible is that to kids today?
Yep.
But something related to this that comes to mind is, with agency among students and workers, is this idea of trust. I mean, how ready are companies to trust this remote, set of workers with these skills who have high degrees of self-agency and their own points of view about how to solve problems? I think there's sort of two aspects to that. Is one is one of my questions is how do you sort of manage that, and the second part of that is what kind of personal skills, we just call them soft skills, but what kind of success skills do individuals need? Social skills, communication, collaboration, problem solving, all the stuff we've talked about for years, I think are just so important now. And how do you practice that? In schools, we got to start practicing that in school. I think simulation training and doing your own stuff is a way to do it. Broadskilling does point to some resources where people can go to. I really look for curating some content around, go here, create a bot, go here, create an EC2 instance, do this, because that's so vital. Not all kids are going to be interested in that, but that's the way forward, creating these opportunities.
So along those lines, I'm curious, what are you, outside of leveraging this methodology, this platform, what type of direction are you able to offer educators, learning and development, professionals? What can we do to ensure that we're supporting the future of work?
So a couple of things. One is, I blog because I like to share points of view, and I welcome feedback. And that's, I got to where I am today because of talking to people smarter than me. I want everybody to reach out. I mean, that's the key, one of the Broadskilling keys. The second thing I offer is I reach out to teachers and provide sort of formal direction. And I include my contact information in every set of directions and every template, because I want teachers to be able to reach out and ask questions. Now, this is sort of my side gig. This is what I do out of passion.
Yep.
What I do at work at IMSA constantly informs what I do. But I make myself available in the evenings. I respond to email. I talk to teachers. I just had a conversation 2 days ago with somebody from the Illinois Association for Career and Technical Education, who I think does a fabulous job at doing this sort of, hands-on skilling, giving these students this idea, the opportunities to go do things and understand the world of work. You mentioned something earlier about skill, pathways that do not involve college. One of the great opportunities that I include in Broadskilling is skilled trades. Because if I look at, I looked at the educational attainment data in the census, and 60 or 70% of our population doesn't complete a college degree by the time they're 25. So what happens to the other 60 or 70%? Our future economy depends on a skilled workforce, which is not just, something we think of as a traditional sort of white collar job. It's everything. So Broadskilling applies to everything from people who do not want to go to college, people who want to develop their own learning plan, to people who want to follow this sort of traditional education paradigm. Nothing wrong with that.
let's talk about, we touched on a little bit earlier, but kind of what we're going through right now with COVID-19. What are some of the challenges that you see, and how is this potentially changing or disrupting, our trajectory, if you will, in terms of the future of work?
Wow. So that's an important one. We're all living it. A lot of us are working remotely. We didn't before. So how's it affecting us? Well, I think the most clear thing is that it's been a massive migration to online, the online modality. Unfortunately, that really quick migration is a migration. It's not a transition. It's not a transformation. And so I think that's the biggest challenge. But it also represents an opportunity, because the teachers I talk to, they're starting to get their feet. They're starting to stand up. They're starting to think, getting comfortable with this online delivery mechanism. But the transformational part, that's going to be when we have a generation of teacher designers who make the pivot from teaching and delivering instruction to creating learning experiences. And that sort of learning architecture view that maybe the L&D people understand is not something that I hear when I talk to teachers. It's like gobbledygook in some respects. So when I say full stack learning designer, a lot of L&D people will kind of get that. Will be like, okay, I get this. I understand the technology, my learner, the content, the feedback loop, and how I'm going to organize this. Teachers tend, in my experience, not always to think that way. Some do it intuitively. But I think to do the most good for our students and to enable our teachers, we have to enable them to start thinking like a learning designer, to think about asynchronous components, and to look at cloud sourcing some of the learning experiences. I'll give you an example. There's a company I'm familiar with that has engineering simulations for students. Now, how cool is that? Now, they've had it for years, but suddenly that's become really relevant. If I'm going to teach engineering or physics or mathematics, boy, those things are really relevant. They're available on the web. But how many teachers know about that? It's just not the way we've traditionally enabled teachers. No fault to teachers. My mom was a teacher and my sister was a teacher. Love teachers. But it's just a different way of thinking about education. And it's the old paradigm of, I'm going to manage my classroom. I'm going to deliver instructions. I've got a curriculum sequence. And oh, by the way, we're incentivizing them to get ready for the tests, because they're going to be measured on the test scores of their students, which is a different challenge. One of the reasons I did Broadskilling the way I did it, delivered it, is it's really hard to change education. But it's better to go direct to students.
Direct to consumer here. Yeah, for sure.
Direct to consumer.
Yeah.
And that's really my approach. First students, then teachers. And then I am looking forward to developing a more mature set of offerings, sort of a curriculum, if you will. Everything will be inquiry based. I just believe strongly that it's got to be driven by the learner. And the outcome has to be a demonstration that, I've asked the questions and I have some answers.
What we're finding, through COVID-19 and even just kind of the current state, is that our client organizations are much more open to skill sets that support the entirety of the individual, that are maybe not as inline and role specific, and that enable employees to create wellness and balance between their personal and their professional lives. Clearly now is a time where organizations are supporting their employees in new ways. And I think a great almost byproduct of that is that organizations are much more open to bringing training in on empathy and resilience and situational intelligence and EQ. And I think, we're kind of going through a phase right now where a lot of organizations are kind of offering this training almost a la carte. And I think we're quickly moving to a state where folks are going to want to start to make some sense of it all. And folks are going to want some tools and potentially some learning experiences that kind of bring all of these together. And so, we've worked with a couple clients on doing just that, because there's also, I know in corporate America right now, there's also a little bit of like training fatigue that's happening.
Oh, yeah.
Because everybody now that's behind a computer screen can be a part of, hours and hours and hours of digital content training, which we know is different than the face-to-face. And I'm assuming you're seeing that as well too.
We are in, the term I hear a lot is cognitive load. And that's about, overwhelming people with lots of information and lots of activity. And it's akin to Zoom fatigue. I mean, I think we need to have a lot more empathy for the learners. My daughters are upstairs now and have been on Zoom classrooms all day. I do it all day. I know a number of us do as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the hard part is, enabling students and, staff, employees like us. It goes back to the fundamentals of what are the big rocks? And am I going to schedule in some non-negotiable time to get that stuff done? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, all these digital experiences are going to run my life. And that one of the impacts of COVID, I think I've seen a sort of a cycle in my life, and I think others have reinforced that. When we made the pivot in March, my work involves management and Salesforce administration. So I found myself spending 12, 13 hours a day online doing stuff to be productive, because that's kind of how I'm wired. And then I realized, I can't keep this up. It's because I don't have to commute anymore. I can log in a little early, knock some stuff out. But what I'm finding is I can't control when I leave. It's harder to control when I leave when I'm getting requests, because I'm more incented to kind of respond to that request. So one of the skills is going to have to be this, diligence around knowing myself, wellness. So I think you're exactly right. And it's lovely to hear that corporations are starting to take that into account.
So by day, you run PMO at IMSA.
I do.
Correct. So you're also an organizer, a prioritizer. You deal with a lot of information. I'm curious, as we think about, you just touched on something about kind of like cognitive load and information overload, and I don't think that's going away even as we kind of go back to the office or even the classroom. Right. How do you see us as humans being able to organize, prioritize, and leverage information in the future? And maybe what technologies will enable us to better leverage, data and information as it comes at us, full speed ahead, as I think a lot of us have been experiencing.
I think asking the right questions, and that's a kind of a personal social thinking skill. It's a cognitive skill. But on the learning side, the other part is what I would call, it's not only memorizing a set of questions, it's a cognitive strategy, which is a higher level intellectual skill, which is I'm defining what my questions need to be. Now, how do you get there? I think that's going to take ongoing mentorship and conversation and prompting. In terms of the tool set, I think we still have to have the process of, the old concept of the big rocks in the vase, right? The Covey concept. What's the most important thing for me to do? What's the most important question that I need to be asking to get the results that I'm accountable for? And what can I defer? I find myself diligently journaling in OneNote every day, because that's how I take the cognitive load and I put it on a shelf in OneNote, right, and I just revisit it when I need it. So we have to get really good at
Or you don't.
Absolutely.
There's value in even the exercise of taking information and synthesizing it.
It is, but remember what Brad Kohler said last week about data? It's like, what information do you need to drive the question you're answering? Yeah. To make the decision you're going to make. We all have to get better at that, to turn all this data into the information that is tied to a decision. That's the skill we're going to need, and students need as well. The issue I have, though, it's harder for students because everything might be on the test. The other observation I had in terms of, what tools can help is, there's sort of been this maxim in education that, you can't cheat in education. But when you get to the business world, it's okay to cheat. because I'm gonna give you my templates and help you get up to speed. And it's interesting that there's still sort of that dynamic. What is the outcome of learning? What is the actual measure? Is a question educators need to ask. But you know what? It's never going to go away. It's always going to be relevant in the corporate space as well.
Yeah.
What key decisions do I need to make? And why are we talking about X when we need to be talking about Y?
Yep.
I don't know about you, but one of the things we need in terms of our agency is to be able to point out, to ask the question in a meeting, are we admiring the problem or are we making a decision? One of my mentors led off every meeting with, okay, what's the X of the meeting? You put an X on the whiteboard. And that was part of a mental shift for me to go, oh yeah, you know what? That's how I need to run this. I think all of us need to be much more efficient in that regard. But the trade-off is, like you said, we're humans. How do you remain empathic?
Yeah.
It's physical distancing, not social distancing. It's how I've been thinking about it lately. I didn't invent that. I just heard it and it resonated. I'm like, you know what? With all this technology, there is no reason for me to have social distance.
There's an argument though that some of us could use some distance from social media platforms. That is for sure. Yes. But I totally agree with the principle. I want to maybe drill into what we as learning professionals can do to develop ourselves and prepare ourselves to drive these capabilities of the future. And I think it'd be fun to kind of go back and forth. Maybe you share some thoughts in terms of, you've been in the L&D space, you've been in the education space. We talk about learning practitionership. This is, our ability to continue to evolve and sharpen our sword and continue to see these capabilities that we need to be driving in our learners and understand that it could mean a whole new skill set for us. And I'll throw one out there that you mentioned earlier that is just becoming extremely relevant for adult learning professionals. And that is the ability to be the learning experience architect, we call it. Yes. And that doesn't mean that you need to go and get a formal degree or accreditation in curriculum design. That's the tip of the iceberg. As our learners are experiencing information in different ways, and as their tastes in terms of self-directed learning pathways, and really truly that autonomy, that choice is at the forefront of everything they do, we have to have a certain ability to design for different types of learning preferences and orientations. And what we're doing a lot of is we're going even outside of the learning and development function within organization. And we're enabling folks, even subject matter experts within the organization, to develop a little bit of a sense of what it's like to design for a specific group of people, or to spin up a workshop that has a little bit more impact than you just kind of lecturing slides. So the whole concept of learning design and becoming the learning experience architect is something that we're really trying to develop in our adult learning professionals and practitioners. What's a skill or a capability that you really believe should be in all of our bags as well?
Yeah. So first of all, I think I totally get that. My blog is called the Learning Architect blog because I learned so much from people who have shown me different layers, different questions to ask when designing a learning experience. One skill set we got to have is empathy for the learner, to understand what the entry skills are. This same stuff we learned earlier, but in this case, it's what's the situation we're planning for? What access do they have? It's not just content. It's not just the andragogy of the learning approach. It's also the sort of learning community. I think that's the biggest change I see is in this world, there's sort of three components: the content, the learning architecture, or you could call it andragogy, and the community, which is the resources. It's the social networking. It's not just that one experience we're designing. It is, I think it's more powerful if you have this ongoing plan to make it painless. Who do you connect with? I follow people and I find that relevant. Yeah. So do we have this plan to have sequenced experiences you can opt into? And is there a way for me to know it's relevant? But you know what's really interesting about what you said is it's not only the learner experience architect. I like the idea of a learning operations architect because you need both.
Sure. Yep.
Because you need to know, how is this thing going to sustain itself? How are we going to keep the content fresh? Who makes the decision about retiring it? That stuff's not really sexy to think about when you're designing the learning experience. But for it to last and persist, you got to have that. The other thing I think we need to be good at is instead of thinking of learning as a separate experience, integrating it into the organization function. So, for example, let's say we're about to release a 10K report, or we just did. Maybe we have our employees or a select group of them look at that, do their own research about the field we're competing in, and come back with their own personal assessment of where they think the company needs to go. And then suddenly you have this idea of this sort of crowdsourcing, you have buy-in, and I think there's a lot of potential for engagement as you move forward. Through all this uncertainty, you need everything you can do to bind and anchor people to the organizational mission. And again, it honors the agency of the employee and the learner.
So I want to maybe finish on a question that could ultimately, bridge the gap between, the groups of folks that you're tapping into and the groups of folks that we're working with every day, because I feel like that gap is narrowing. And I'll maybe just ask the question, how can employers leverage broad skilling within their organizations? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, a couple of ways. One is look at the framework. You're welcome to use it. I think it's relevant for two areas. One is for employee development. We always think about, what are your goals? What's your plan to get there?
Yeah.
Another way to do that is to ask the three questions that Broadskilling ask. What do I think is the relevant skill? What's my point of view? What's my own personal plan to be relevant? And what are the outcomes that my company wants to see? What are the skills? The other part is more of a social value as a way to build community brand. Leverage Broadskilling to schools in your areas, wherever you're located, if you think it's useful. I think that's a great way to scale that and to offer some value. And, there's actually a third thing I'm thinking of now, which is something just to think about. The idea of integrating, offering to schools an insight into what it takes to do the business you do, whether that's a series of video interviews. In the old day, a year ago, we were sending students to do internships. Now we're trying to figure out how do you do an internship in a digital fashion. There are companies out there who do that, mostly at the college level, but what a great opportunity to offer to schools in your area.
That's cool. That's wonderful. I want to maybe just close with, because I feel like there's probably going to be some people that want to learn more about Broadskilling. Where can they learn more about Broadskilling, and how could they potentially reach out to you if they'd like to learn more?
Absolutely. You can learn more at broadskilling.com. My contact information is on the site. You can follow Broadskilling. Every time I post a blog, you'll get notified. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Just look for Richard Busby, PMO Director, IMSA. You'll find me there. And I'm easy to find, richard@broadskilling.com.
Wonderful. Richard, we want to thank you for stepping into the discussion today. I was just really curious on the concept of the future of work. We talk about the future of learning all the time. I feel like there's so much overlap in terms of the way we work and we learn. And it was also really interesting to uncover a lot of the commonalities in terms of the way we develop our younger generation versus the way that we're developing employees and professionals within larger organizations. So just really, really appreciate those connections, appreciate your thought leadership. And I've gotten to know Rich over the last couple of weeks. He's widely available to go deeper. So if anybody's interested in learning more, definitely reach out to Rich. I'll also let everybody know that our Navigating Now Roundtable discussions will continue every week Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock. We've got a host of leaders lined up through the end of October. So we look forward to announcing those over the course of the next few days. If you all are interested in registering for those conversations and being a part of the conversation, you can go to thoughttium.com/live. We stream live on YouTube every week as well too. That's YouTube/Thoughttium. We got a couple thanks in the chat box. Jessica, thanks so much for joining. Jessica says spot on the content. And again, we want to thank everybody who joined via Zoom, those folks who popped in over LinkedIn, and to our YouTube community. We look forward to bringing you leaders like Rich, discussions like these on an episode by episode basis. We'll see you next week.